Let's talk about the revolution against the Empire, and also some Star Wars. The Rebel Alliance is an echo of America's origin story, and it illustrates some peculiar aspects of that story, namely what we call the Revolution. Historically speaking, revolutions tend to be complete shit shows. The biggest examples, of course, are France and Russia, but if we look across the world, we see countless smaller examples. Revolutions usually unleash misery and end in tyranny, except in America and presumably in the New Republic. Only America didn't have a revolution. We had a separatist movement. See, the American colonists didn't have to overthrow the king, co-opt or eliminate the aristocracy, and then govern the entire British Empire. All they had to do was to shoot enough redcoats that they would leave, and then they were able to go on governing themselves largely as they had before. Rather than overthrowing the entire social order and political system, all that happened in the United States was the top layer of governance was scraped off, leaving everything that was below it intact, and therefore the impact was relatively minimal. To a lesser extent, you could say the same thing about India after the British left, although there was some mayhem in that with partition and all. The point being that separatism is a much less destabilizing undertaking than complete revolution. Unfortunately, by labeling our separatist movement as the American Revolution, it skews the American perception of what revolutions are. And this is reflected not only in our history, but in our popular culture. So let's look at the Rebel Alliance. Underdogs against a great empire, fighting for liberty, justice, all those good things. As an American kid growing up, this resonated with me. These were my people. This is our story. But hold on, Jedi. The rebels aren't trying to free Alderaan from Imperial occupation. They're trying to overthrow the Emperor and install a new government for the entire galaxy. It's the polar opposite of fighting for independence. Now, don't get me wrong, I can always get behind throwing tyrants off high balconies, but I don't think it's going to end with a parade and an election. And now, where this starts to really get interesting is that because the Rebel Alliance is depicted as trying to overthrow an entire galactic government, they are, on the surface, much more revolutionary than the American colonies who just wanted independence. However, when we dig a little bit deeper, we see that the American Revolution actually had much more of a true revolutionary spirit to it, in that the goal was not only to throw off the control of a foreign power, but also to remake the underlying foundations of the governing system into one that embodied the Enlightenment ideals that were making the rounds at the time. You know, citizens rather than subjects, representative government, consent of the governed, these concepts that are largely taken for granted now, even as they're eroded. What we see of the Rebel Alliance is reactionary, counter-revolutionary, you might say. The Rebel Alliance is founded by former senators and aristocrats who lost power and wealth and prestige with the fall of the Republic. And then when we look at the people who are fighting for the rebellion, it's all these people who were too young to remember what a corrupt mess the Republic was. At its core, the rebellion looks backward. It's clinging to that ultra-conservative idea of just make things back the way they were, or more accurately, make things the way that I remember them being in my idealized, mythologized version of events. Looking at the wider conflict in the galaxy, which we could refer to as a galactic civil war, which again gets distorted through the lens of American history because of the failed separatist movement that we call the Civil War. Star Wars parallels this very closely with the Confederacy of Independent Systems that kicks off the Clone Wars, which, like the Confederate States of America, had defined territory and borders and was functioning as an independent state. And the The fighting was about getting recognition for that already existing status. But the Rebel Alliance is everywhere. There's no rebel territory, there are no designated rebel systems or a rebel border. They don't control half the galaxy that's fighting against the other half. It's dispersed through the entire population. Anybody could be part of the rebellion. This diffuse nature of it, this evenly spreading it through the entire population, makes this a civil war in the truest, purest sense. Now, I know there are some people who would say that the rebellion is a terrorist organization. I reject that characterization solely because from what we see in the Star Wars films and shows, the rebels consistently target military targets, which, even though some of them may be rear echelon and kind of shady, it's a legitimate target. But why am I blathering on about this? It's because there's a feedback loop. While our history is foundational to the Star Wars story, that story in turn has become so deeply rooted in our popular culture that it affects how we view the world in some sense. But a closer examination of the Star Wars story prompts us to ask some questions. Who's funding these separatists? Who benefits from the Clone Wars? Do we really trust the motives of these senators organizing a rebellion against the Emperor that overthrew them? Sometimes these are questions that we have to ask about our myths so that we can learn how to ask them about our contemporary politics and our real world, which, I mean, when we get down to it, our politics are really just transient, expedient myths anyway. The stories we tell ourselves shape our world, and whether they originate in our history or in our entertainment, they create a scaffolding for our understanding. We as Americans have a cultural affinity for rebels, going back to our very beginnings. However, we can also very easily forget that the worst empires in recent history began as rebellions. As I record this, we have a proxy war going on right now in the Ukraine against Russia. Tensions are rising with China. We may be witnessing the beginnings of a very bitter national divorce here in America. And all of this is presented to us not in raw data or facts, but as stories, complete with heroes and villains. It behooves us to always bear in mind that stories are more powerful than guns, and both can be used for good or evil.